This is Father Vogel. We continue our series on St. Francis de Sales' Introduction to the Devout Life. We are in part 4, looking at temptations, as well as we considered anxiety, spiritual sadness. We looked at God's good consolations and how we should properly understand them. And following speaking about consolations, we also want to look at the other end of the spectrum, the desolations, the times where we might feel that God is absent in our lives, or a kind of spiritual boredom. He also uses that image as well. So he says of spiritual consolations first, that this fine weather, so pleasant, will not always last. Sometimes it will happen that the feelings of devotion will be completely removed and taken away from you. Then you will feel like an arid desert, fruitless and barren, where there is no path or road to God, nor any water of grace to water it, because the drought there turns it to a wasteland. So that's what it feels like inside, this kind of dryness, or God is completely absent in this case. Kind of an appropriate landscape we're in right here. Our heart maybe feels like the barrenness of this area right here. You must discover the source of the evil. In fact, we ourselves are often the cause of our barrenness and of our dryness. So this is one of the things that we want to understand, is that have we ourselves in some way done something to bring about this kind of barrenness? So he gives us a number of different ways or reasons or where this barrenness might come from. So he says first that God deprives us of his consolations when we take some vain pleasure in them. So if we have become attached to his consolations so that we love consolations more than we love God, he certainly doesn't want that for us. And so he will remove them from us so that we are not attached to them in a way that isn't going to be good for us, for our soul. Secondly, he says that when we do not care to gather the sweetness and the delights of the love of God in its proper time, he withdraws them from us in a kind of punishment for our sloth. So this would be the case in which God gives us consolations, but we kind of ignore them, or we kind of when God is prompting our heart to do something, that we have these other things that are more important at the time, and so we neglect to follow up and pay attention to him. So he uses the example from the story of Exodus when the Israelites are in the desert. He says that the Israelites, when God gave them the manna, this bread from heaven, that they were required to gather it right away in the morning, but if they didn't do it right away, then it would basically disappear, melt away. So it's the same kind of way with the consolations that God gives, is that if we don't gather the consolation when he gives it to us, we will likely find that it doesn't stick around for very long. Next, he says, number 3, sometimes we rest on a bed of sensible delights and passing consolations. So this is a kind of laziness where we don't go forth to do the things God asks of us, but rather we just kind of sit there. So the Beloved knocks at the door of our hearts, and he inspires us to resume our spiritual exercises, but we bargain with him because we are displeased to cast aside these vain amusements and deprive ourselves of these false satisfactions. Therefore he goes away and leaves us in our sloth. So just like any friend might come by and say like, hey, come join us in this, and we're like, no, I don't want to do that, I don't feel like it today. Well, then we lose our opportunity to take part in that activity. So in the same way, we can lose out on God's consolations. The fourth one that he gives, he says, insincerity and subtlety in our confessions, and spiritual talks with our director lead to spiritual boredom and the absence of sensible consolations. If you lie to the Holy Spirit, it is not surprising that He denies you His consolations. If you are not simple and sincere like a little child, you will not receive the sweets of the little child. So if we're not sincere to God in prayer, or sincere, he says, to our spiritual director in talking about the things that are actually going on, then, it's not surprising that God won't be able to give us the consolations that we really are seeking, because we're not being honest in our relationship with Him. So just as, if you find a friend that's not being honest with you, if you sense that, you're not likely to go out of your way to try to continue that friendship. And so in the same way, God may remove some of His consolations when we do that. Number 5, another reason why we might not experience consolations and experience this kind of spiritual boredom is that, have you fed yourself greedily on the worldly pleasures? It's not surprising that you have a distaste for spiritual delights. So if we become accustomed to, the frivolous things of the world, and we become attached to those things, then when God sends us His spiritual consolations, we don't receive them, we don't accept them, because they have no interest to us, because of the way we've formed ourselves apart from them, based upon these otherworldly things. Number 6, he says, have you been careful to preserve the fruits of the consolations you have received? If so, you will receive more. For to him who has more, more will be given. And for him who has not, what has been given to him, but has been lost by his own fault, even that which he has will be taken away from him. So this is from Matthew's Gospel. Jesus used a parable to illustrate this. So God, if He gives us the consolations and we take care to actually act fruitfully based upon them, then He'll continue to give more. But if He gives a consolation and we do nothing with it, and we kind of, we ignore it, or it doesn't really change our actions in any way, then He's likely to not give us more. Even what we have will be taken away. So, these are different examples of ways in which it might be our fault for why we might not receive consolation. Might not be receiving consolation, but rather desolation. So he says we need to examine our conscience to see if we can observe in ourselves any of the defects mentioned earlier. And if we discover that the cause of the evil is in ourselves, he says, in a sense, we can thank God, since an evil is half cured when its cause is discovered. That's the beautiful thing, is that once we discover some kind of fault within us, then now God gives us the opportunity to change. We don't have to continue to act that way, but we can, through His grace, live a different way. We can be renewed in following Him. And if we do that, then we'll find a return of the experience of His consolations. Though he says, if after we've sought out, we've made that examination of conscience, and we discover, actually, I don't really notice anything. Maybe I can't tell that there's something wrong. If you find nothing in particular which seems to have caused this spiritual dryness, do not waste any time on a more careful examination. In all simplicity, without any further examination into details, follow the instructions I now give you. So this is going to be the case in which we discover that maybe it's not our own fault. Maybe God has removed these consolations for other reasons. And in fact, before we go into what we should do, he kind of mentioned some of these other reasons already in the chapter on consolation. So it could be the fact that God is testing us, that He wants us to grow, not just to love Him for the good things that He gives us, but to love Him, love Himself, not just the pleasurable things, the consolations that He gives. And secondly, I don't think he mentioned this quite as explicitly, and these are things you also find within Saint Ignatius of Loyola in his discernment of spirits, is that it could be that God wants to teach us that when these consolations are not our doing, that when it's so that we know that it's a gift from God rather than us who are producing it. So, if we can't find, as we examine our conscience, fault within ourselves as to what we might have done to prevent these consolations. So he says to do the following. He says, number one, humble yourself profoundly before God. So if we place ourselves in this position of humility, God, we're totally within your hands. I know that only by your will can we experience these consolations. Second, he says to implore God and ask him earnestly for his joy. So we ask him for his consolations. God, here I am, I'm present. I want to be able to experience you in a greater way. Help me to experience your joy. Third, he says, then we'll go to your confessor. Open your heart fully to him, and making him see all your interior dispositions. So this is to make sure that there is nothing in the way that's preventing God's consolations. And finally, 4 is going to be, resigning ourselves to God's will. He says, I do not say that we should not have the wishes to be free from this kind of feeling of desolation. We should desire God's consolations. But I say we should not set our heart on it. We shouldn't have this absolute attachment to it as though our relationship with God 100% depends upon it. For we know that God can at any moment return his consolations. So he says, we must resign ourselves to the full mercy of God's special providence, so that he can use us as long as it pleases him in the midst of those thorns and among those deserts. So he says as well that we can be like Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Father, if it be possible, take away this chalice from me. But let us add with great courage, nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. So we want to have this complete submission that the Lord gave the way that Job had. We find in the Old Testament that the Lord gave me consolations, and the Lord has taken them away from me. Blessed be his holy name. If we persevere in this kind of humility, he will give back to us his delightful favors, as he so did in returning those favors back to Job. Finally, he says for us to be full of courage. Let us wait patiently for the return of the consolations, always continuing on our way. Let us never leave out the exercises of devotion that we have set before us, but rather, if possible, even to multiply the good works, to respond and try to follow God in an even greater way. He concludes with one last piece of advice when it comes to these kinds of the state of dryness or desolation or spiritual boredom. He says that many, and he says especially women often, make a great mistake in thinking that the service we offer to God is less pleasing to his divine majesty when done without relish, without tenderness of heart, and without feeling. So if we're not feeling like we're being devout, then we're not devout. But our actions are like roses, which are more beautiful when fresh, yet have a greater fragrance and power when dry. So just because we don't have those emotional or feel like we're being devout, if we're continuing to do those faithful actions, then we're still doing the will of God. So even so, he says, though our works done with tenderness of heart are more pleasing to ourselves I say, who only consider our own satisfaction, yet when performed in a state of spiritual dryness and desolation, they have a greater fragrance and are more valuable in the sight of God. God bless.